Hello again. We are now
Oh,
with Denise Smith, who is the Director of Juvenile Court Services for Pinal County. Denise, welcome. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. And was wondering if you would tell us a little bit about the work you do and a little bit about your background.
sure. I have been with Juvenile Court Services for going on 35 years. I started here in Pinal County in 1986, and I've been a probation officer. I worked as a director, juvenile court division director, and in probation, and I worked in administration, and I actually worked about 4 years in the juvenile detention facility as a manager there. About 5 years ago, I was promoted to the director of juvenile court services. And so, what does that mean? Well, it means that I oversee not just probation, but I also oversee the juvenile detention facility. And, we look at programs. We want to look at what works best in evidence based practices around working with youth in the juvenile world. And, we spend a lot of time on research and data. And that's really how we've been running our organization the past 5 years.
Gotcha. So you've really seen juvenile court services from all angles over 35 years. Wow, that's great. That's awesome. So talk to us a little more specifically about what you see in terms of like how many cases, and I'm not exactly sure of the right language, but how many convictions there are in Pinal County that involve youth. And then I think the second part of that question is how many of those cases involve youth and substances.
Well, I can tell you, and I'm going to go back to the data from last year. This year has been a different year for all of us. And so I
For
think
sure it has.
right now, the numbers are a bit artificial at this point. So they're not the real numbers that we've seen previous. So I'm going to go back to 2019, and Juvenile Court Services last year received around 1,500 referrals from the local law enforcement agencies in Pinal County. Of those referrals, about 16% were drug-related offenses.
Okay.
57% of those were around the use of marijuana and possession, and approximately 9% of those was possession of use of narcotic drugs. In Pinal County, we don't have just probation. We also have a diversion program, which we see the majority of the cases. So those 1,500 referrals that I'm referring to are not referrals that all those kids are going to court and being placed on probation. About 70% of those actually go through our diversion program, which is very informal, an informal court process.
So you have diversion, you have probation, and then kind of the highest level is detention.
Yes, so the diversion is the lowest, the informal level. Then we have the probation, and kind of along with probation is detention. Do we have kids in our detention facility who are not on probation? Absolutely, we do. As a matter of fact, today we have more of those kids than we do kids on probation. But it's just, it's the whole package. It's, probation, diversion, probation, and detention. But again, like I said, detention kind of covers it all, but we don't use detention for diversion. That's
Hmm.
more of an informal, non-court involved type of process.
Gotcha. So between all three, how many youth are involved in diversion, probation, and detention in Pinal County like today?
So today, our probation numbers are fairly low. We have short of 300 youth on probation. That's the different levels of probation. So we have a standard probation population, and we have kids who are on juvenile intensive probation. Today, we have 7 kids in our youth detention, our youth justice center, which is our detention facility.
Gotcha. So could you hazard a guess and say how many of those kids are there because the crimes they have committed have involved substances, either directly or indirectly?
I will say, on my experience, the last year up to present, 60 to 70% of the kids who are in detention are there, whether it's an original referral for drugs or substances in the facility, or it's a juvenile who has committed another offense, but substances is the underlying issue.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Wow. Wow. That's amazing. But that's, I mean, that's consistent with what we're hearing in other avenues. A lot of the crimes that Mr. Volkmer talked about also involve substances as well. So that, to me, that's just astounding that that percentage can be that high.
Yes.
Um, so, um, so typically, and I'm guessing that it's certainly a case by case kind of scenario, but typically, how long are juveniles involved with your services, with diversion or probation or detention?
So with diversion, it's fairly short turnaround, usually from the time they enter into the system, into the probation department, to the time that they're released from diversion is usually between 30 and 90 days.
Okay.
For youth who are placed on probation, again, this is not, I can just give you kind of an average type situation. Youth placed on probation between 6 months to a year.
Gotcha.
Typically about 9 months is about our average.
Okay. And then detention.
Our average length of stay in detention right now is close to 22 days. Again, understand that detention is not a long-term placement. It's a
Okay.
short-term placement until another option is located for the juvenile to be released to. Sometimes it's home
Gotcha.
with services, sometimes it's with relatives, sometimes it's in a group home. Some of these kids are involved with the child welfare system, and so sometimes they might go to a foster home, or they might end up in a treatment program, or we ourselves, the court, might place a juvenile into a treatment facility
Mm,
from detention.
gotcha. So I think that's great information. Now let's dig down a little further. You've talked about diversion and probation, and I guess it would be great to give our audience a sense of what that looks like and feels like on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis. Like, what's involved with being on probation, and, is it time consuming? Do you think it's stressful for kids? Talk a little bit about that.
Okay. So youth who are placed on probation are, they're required by the court and by probation directive to meet with their probation officer on a regular basis. Now, what that means is it depends upon the type of risk factors that are involved, and we do risk assessments on every juvenile before they're placed on probation to determine what type of supervision we need to provide or what type of services we need to provide. And that's all around, that's evidence-based, the evidence-based practices. And so once we have done the interview and determined the risk factor, then we also identify the needs. And so oftentimes, a juvenile is seen by a probation officer at least once a month, but we can go as far as a juvenile being seen by a probation officer 3 times a week. It just depends on the level of risk that's identified in the assessment. On top of the supervision, you also have juveniles who are required to attend counseling. The individuals, sometimes family counseling, frequent and unannounced drug testing is involved, community service work. There's also fines and restitution if it's appropriate in the particular case. They might have to participate in complete substance abuse classes. We also have, if there's a victim involved in the case, we also ask that they participate and complete a victim impact panel. We also have them participating in home detention. So, the judge may not place them in the detention facility, but when they're home, they have to stay home. And some kids will be monitored by a GPS electronic monitoring system. There are occasions when the judge will order a juvenile in the detention facility for a prescribed period of time. And there are also some cases where a juvenile is on probation and they're placed out of home in a residential treatment facility to address the substance abuse issues. So
So
in terms
it's
of time, I mean, it's a lot of time, and
Right.
we're directing um, kids and parents actually to participate. We're directing, yes, you can go to a friend's house, or no, you can't. Yes, you can go visit a family, or no, you can't. So, the probation officers have a lot of discretion and a lot of autonomy. And again, the decisions that are made based solely on how the child's doing. So if a juvenile is doing really well, then we may give a little bit of leeway and say, yes, you can go to the store with your mother, or yes, you can go hang out with friends. But again, it depends on the behavior of the child on probation.
So I want to back you up a minute. I think I heard you say ask permission, and is that ask permission for the individual, or is it permission for the family in some cases as well?
It's for the individual,
Okay,
but we do have cases where the judges order the parents, you have to stay home
gotcha.
with your child. If you go somewhere, you need to get permission from the probation officer to go. So it's really a little of both.
So this is all on top of young people going to school and being involved in student activities and athletics, and it's really adding a whole great deal more to everybody's plates to have to be on probation or even diversion.
Absolutely.
Gotcha. So next question. Um, in your opinion, how well do you think the youth really genuinely handle the stressors of uh, being involved with detention or probation or even diversion? How well do they manage the stress? What kinds of behavior do you see with the kids?
Well, it's never easy when you have an officer of the court giving a directive and basically telling you, what you can and cannot do for the next 9 months to a year or 6 months. Some youth do well with structure. I will say that some youth really kind of need that. And in some cases, we have kids where they kind of thrive on that attention, if you will, of the court. But there are others that struggle with the idea that their freedom is taken away. So having to ask permission to go to the store, as I mentioned earlier, or hanging out with friends, or spending time with family, or even traveling from Pinal County to Maricopa County to go to get a pair of shoes at the mall, if you will. Those they have to get permission for that, and who you can hang out with and who you can't hang out with. So yes, there are kids that do struggle, and we do find that youth on probation for drug related offenses tend to struggle the most, simply
Wow.
because they have difficulty ceasing the use of drugs and not having the ability to hang out with friends, that they've previously done drugs with. So we tend to find those kids, typically what they do is they'll leave. We've seen patterns with some of these kids where they know that they're going to get drug tested. They're going to take off for a couple of days, and then they're going to come back, and then they get drug tested. Sometimes it works for them and sometimes it doesn't.
Mhm.
But these are also kids who are usually the ones who end up in the juvenile detention center for, positive UAs or urinalysis, or they've gotten in trouble again. And it may not necessarily be with drugs. It could be something separate, something completely different.
So I guess one of the things I guess I kind of wonder about is that it sure feels to me like being involved with the justice system, going through the process of being charged with the crime and going to court and having juvenile court services assigned um, is all, I don't know, related to kids, I don't know, making unwise choices. I think a lot of it feels like it's maybe motivated by the stress the kids are feeling in their lives, and they look to drugs or other dangerous behaviors as a relief from that stress rather than get help. Um, and I guess to me, one of the things I wonder about is when they complete juvenile court services, do you feel like they've they've changed as individuals, and do you think they're better able to deal with the stress they feel in their lives?
So yes, I do. I think, when we go back and look at our statistics, our recidivism rate is very low.
Cool.
And it's
That's
it's
great.
a good thing, obviously, that less kids are coming back to the system.
Hmm.
What we're finding is that kids who come back to the system are getting in trouble. And I'm not going to say intentional, but they're continuing to participate in the antisocial behavior. And then what's happening is that we're getting back involved. And then what they're telling us is that I missed having you around because
Mm.
you were the only solid in my life.
Hmm.
And so that's certainly a message that kids struggle with a environment, B, peers, the stress, as you mentioned, they struggle with those things and they kind of need us to get them back in line and to move forward. And so it's a good thing that we're positive in their life, but what's not such a good thing is that they have to come back to get back on track, to be successful. And it makes me feel good that I have great staff that can do that for kids. And I can tell you that we call them probation officers, but quite frankly, they're more mentors for our kids on probation.
Gotcha.
They're solid, and they're their parent, if you will,
Hmm.
to work with them to get them back to a better place. Now, do we have some kids that don't make it? We do, but we never give up hope on those kids. We always believe that they will be successful.
Hmm. Yeah, that's awesome. Well, and I genuinely believe, and I've seen it time and time again, when young people make the decision to do better and to be better. Uh, it just feels to me like when they have that determination internally, they've finally made that decision for themselves. That's when they can start digging out of the hole that they're in, or that's when they can really start improving their lives, that kind of thing. So,
Exactly. And I do want to share this, and that is that we have had way more than a handful of kids who have come back to share their story with their probation officers who were their probation officers when they were on probation. And
mhm,
it's very nice to see that we have a good number of kids who, when they turn 18, it's like something clicks. And it's like, oh my gosh, I'm an adult now and I need to change my behavior. But
gotcha.
what they don't realize is that they now have a record. And
Hmm.
I think that's important for our kids today to know that, if you get involved with the legal system, you're going to have a record. And that record you can take with you. You have to go through a process to destroy your records and to, completely wipe them out of the system.
And
But it's a process.
and I was going to say it impacts your employment options, it impacts your further education options, it even impacts your military options as
It
well.
absolutely does.
Gotcha. So, any reflections on what you see in the youth served by the juvenile court services?
You know, Unfortunately, I've seen a change in our kids. More and more youth are engaging with more dangerous drugs. And the two most common denominators that we have seen is the negative peer associations and a dysfunctional family, which is the biggest struggle for our
Hmm.
probation officers as they're trying to work with kids and families to get them back on track and to move forward. But what I do know is that, and I mentioned it a minute ago, is that kids can be successful. And what I like about this work in the juvenile world is that we have the ability to make an impression. We have the ability to work with the kids and give them the tools and the resources necessary to be successful. And in some cases, we have to set it up to where kids can learn how to be resilient, because sometimes they are in a very negative environment in a bad situation. But if we can teach them to say to themselves, this isn't the way we want to live our life, and this is not the way I want my future to be, if we can get them there, then they will be successful. And that's what we work on with
Hmm.
our kids.
That's awesome. Any final words of advice for high school students?
Yeah, I actually have some. I think that set your goals early. Start thinking about your future now. What does that look like for you? Have hope in yourself and surround yourself with people who believe in you and have hope in you. These times we live in are very challenging times. And at times, we're going to be tempted to fall off the track. But if you do, don't get discouraged. Get right back on track and move forward in a positive direction. And then the other thing I would say is just really be aware of your activity and really think about engaging in more pro-social type activities and surround yourself with positive peers and mentors.
That's awesome. Denise, thank you so much for chatting with us today, and we wish you the very best, and I think we're out, so
You're
take care.
welcome. Thank
Thank
you for
you.
having me.